are exceptionally grateful for People's Bank to underwrite this, the Complete City program. This is the third year that they are a sponsor, and we're exceptionally grateful. So with that, Mark, you have about 60 seconds.
Well, good. I'll do my commercial very quickly. Thank you very much, Addie. It's certainly our pleasure to sponsor such a wonderful nonprofit, if you will, and you're doing a great job. Ever since I've been on board, I've just been extremely impressed with the direction where you're taking us. So very much appreciated. People's United Bank, and I'm just going to do my due diligence. We are going through a merger. Fourth quarter, probably October 1st is when the ink will be dry. And just so I do my due diligence, we are going to be M&T Bank. Renee Jones will be who is the current CEO. He's from a small town in Ayers, Massachusetts, of about 6,000 people. He's certainly an incredible leader. The most impressive thing I will say, two things that I'll say. One about People's United Bank and M&T is, M&T has given over $250 million to the communities it serves over the last decade. That to me is 150% commitment as a strong regional bank, and we're just going to be stronger after October 1st. And you know what? We're open for business today, and we want to help our small business customers, specifically here in the Maine market. And I welcome you all to stop and visit any of our branches throughout the state. Thank you very much, Addie. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you. I guess we will also say thank you to Peoples, and you'll let us know when we trade out that logo.
Of course.
So I also want to thank our sponsor, supporters, and friends and partners. Without all of your support, none of our programs, which are free, would be accessible. This is part of the Complete City, the Portland Society for Architecture's signature program, entering its fourth year. First, it was our Mapping Portland, then it was our Complete City Imagined, which is still on exhibit at Peloton Labs, which can be open on appointment. And last year, in response to social injustice, we launched the Complete City Disconnected, which is still ongoing. But in a few weeks, we are launching Filled In, which will actually, I'm still letting folks in. Which will be on testing and challenging the new ADU policy for the city of Portland. If everyone could mute themselves on coming in, that would be fabulous. We anticipate that this micro-study and competition will open dialogue on the feasibility, affordability, and constructability of increasing density throughout the city, taking advantage of existing vacant spaces, and tapping into the buildings and technologies, sustainable methods, and diverse building typologies for the build out of these structures. And to also keep in mind, as this is a PSA-run event, that design does matter. This is run by an exceptional committee, all of who are on this call, and I'd like to recognize them very quickly. Alyssa Panettistak, who is our PSA board president and an architect with SMRT, Danielle Fwasi, who is our PSA secretary and an architect with Kaplan Thompson. Also with Kaplan Thompson, Ben Bailey and Kara Beyond, and Russ Tyson from Witten, Patrick Costin with Canal 5, and Chris Miller, one of our speakers from last week, who is also a PSA board member. We are exceptionally grateful for all of you. Thank you so much. As I had said during our presentation, please keep yourself on mute. For best viewing, choose the speaker view, which can be found in the top right corner of your Zoom dashboard. There'll be time for questions and answers at the end. And there are a number of folks on here, but you know, it will work out. We like one another, and we'll make this work. Now, and this will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel by the end of today. And with that, I just want to say, as we take time to talk about space, land use, and the ground on which all of this is potentially developed, I want us to pause in remembrance and pay respect to the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine, and of our guest, whose headquarters is based in New York City, the Lenape Nations. With respect for the traditions of these Indigenous people, we affirm their inherent sovereignty in these territories, and we are hopeful for healing. With this, we commit to the ongoing work of decolonization. Thank you. And now here we go with today. We are exceptionally grateful to welcome back Roseanne Haggerty, who was our featured speaker with UNE earlier in October. Roseanne is one of the founders of Community Solutions, an organization that has been around for a couple of decades now, that has this incredible Built for Zero movement that works to really create zero homelessness. When they say it is not a radical belief, that they work with more than 80 cities and counties to make this a reality every day. We are really thrilled and grateful to welcome you back. And then we have Jess Valero, who is an activist and advocate with the Maine People's Housing Coalition, which is a broad coalition of residents working to end homelessness and guarantee access to safe, affordable housing for Mainers. They're nonpartisan and believe that housing is a human right. And without further ado, what I would like to do now is just, we can end the share screen. And Roseanne will go first and give an overview, and then Jess will speak. And then really it's mostly a conversation after that. And again, I'm exceptionally grateful. Ben Bailey is running our slides today, so thank you very much. And I believe we can put up, Roseanne, your slide as well, if that's where we're going to go. Great.
Addie, thank you for inviting me back. And it's really a delight to continue this conversation with you and folks in Portland who are struggling with how to get Portland to a place of zero homelessness. And I'll just provide a little bit of context before I move into the ADU conversation. As Addie mentioned, Community Solutions supports Built for Zero, a national movement now involving 84 city and county regions around the country who have really stepped up to own the fact that this is an entirely solvable problem, but we have to see it differently, we have to understand it completely, and we have to be prepared to change the way we work and the local context, because homelessness, frankly, is not about people who have had individual misfortunes. This is about systems that have broken down around vulnerable people in our communities, and systems that we can change, that we can repair, and that we can actually own, because all of us and members of our family are will experience vulnerability. God knows in the last year that has become so true for everyone on the planet. And so how do we move forward pragmatically and with this vision of having communities that do not leave people on the street and that do not perpetuate failure, frankly. As a country, we spend more than $12 billion annually pre-pandemic responding to homelessness, rather than putting our commitment and resources to work on preventing it and ending it when a housing crisis occurs. And so at the end of my remarks, I'll go into a little bit more detail about how Built for Zero operates. But let me just start with the provocation that, what if homelessness is not just about housing supply? What if it is also about housing supply plus the absence of an organized system driven by the intention of having everyone in our communities in a safe and decent place to live? And so it's with that mindset that our teams are working with communities around the country to really understand by name in real time who is experiencing homelessness, to create that shared truth and that reality of how is this issue playing out and for whom, and where are people becoming vulnerable to homelessness, what can be repaired to prevent it, and what do we have to do to quickly move people in a housing crisis to rapid assistance and to lasting solutions. And once communities know that the true nature and the dynamics of homelessness in their community, they can really understand, often for the first time, what part of that problem is housing supply. And so turning to that question, but it's actually in our model, it's sort of the last question you get to. Once you've got your organized system and know exactly how homelessness is being experienced and manifest and changing, week over week, month over month, that's when you need to know how your housing policies actually need to be modified to make sure that they are supporting this goal of zero homelessness, where it's rare, quickly resolved, and that there are data systems in place to flag new cases of housing emergencies. Just like in a pandemic, you want to know, for contact tracing, like what's really happening. That's where we're moving on homelessness. And I'll say that 15 of our 84 communities have already ended homelessness for one or more populations, and another 51 are seeing steady reductions. But how does housing and housing supply fit into that? And the fact is that almost every community has some kind of housing challenge. In Portland, I've become a bit familiar with the specific details thanks to the privilege of having been part of the program in October. And let me start with the sense that there is no one size fits all. There is no one answer. And I think that if we look around the country, we see that having more options so that more people at different moments in their lives and household formation and career development have a range of options that are safe and affordable. But that should be the goal of any community's housing policy, not to just have this or that tool in the toolbox, to really start with that end state of what are we going to need, and how do we create enough flexibility so that the community can respond over time to changing demographics and trends. But I'm especially excited about ADUs and was really intrigued when Addie mentioned this program to me, because I think while we tend to agonize, and God knows I've been through my NIMBY battles over the years as an affordable housing developer, but the idea that we just need like new multifamily projects and that kind of pipeline often kind of obscures the fact that communities have significantly more assets than they appreciate. And when you begin to actually get your arms around who's left out of housing and have a real sense of the number of people experiencing homelessness and trends, it actually creates a pretty interesting moment that we see playing out in many communities, where they are looking at their existing structures that are underutilized or have not even been considered as part of a potential solution to homelessness, and seeing that there's much that can be done that can happen much more quickly than new development. And this is where ADUs, I think, have just this remarkably powerful and hopeful role to play. I'm starting with a slide about an initiative in Los Angeles that is off the ground. It certainly had its fits and starts, but Los Angeles's mayor's office and their Office of Innovation a few years ago proposed to create an incentive program for throughout the county, starting with a few neighborhoods in particular, to incent homeowners to build ADUs. And the first iteration of the plan was there would be some tax relief and some relief in getting the permitting done. And then they had a design contest to have different prototypes. And then they've kind of been back and forth on whether it should be individuals currently experiencing homelessness who are prioritized for these ADUs that the city assists in some manner, or simply just adding housing to the overall supply, so that general investment in new housing could help relieve pressure on the housing market. They've kind of gone back and forth on how to implement this, but one of the interesting things that is worth noting in the Los Angeles example is that once they kind of announced that they were doing this, and it was in the context of California having passed legislation to enable, frankly, more flexible local zoning so that these structures could be permitted. Just the announcement sort of triggered an enormous amount of local creativity and organic action. At the time I visited LA, when they were kind of struggling with how they would roll this out, we actually went to see with the community leaders 3 different already occurring ADU configurations that just resourceful individuals had started turning their garages, or like an extension, like the former den of their house. They'd created a separate entrance, and so just the kind of individual innovation and creativity that was unleashed by signaling the law was going to permit it and that there could be some municipal assistance for owners really ignited a lot of important action. I think there were 600 of these already registered ADUs at the time the city was still kind of figuring out how to design its official program. So I thought it was worth mentioning for a couple of reasons, that the signaling to individual property owners in Portland that you too can play a role in relieving the very evident housing need in the community, that there are small scale individual roles to be played in helping to solve this problem, I think is incredibly exciting. And that creating sort of like an atmosphere of permission and some enabling legislation, even without cash incentives, was all it took. I'm not sure how significant yet the fact that LA has done a design competition and has identified a series of kind of prototypes that have been pre-approved will be to its acceleration. That's still happening now. But that's another way, even beyond the signaling and just clearing the path with legislation and with just the signal that you're not going to be hassled and that this is something that's normative. And more importantly, that all of these small interventions, household by household, can add up to a much larger solution to a community's housing and homelessness crisis is just a really powerful thing. But let me move on to the next slide, because what I think is so interesting in the Portland context is this reality. While Community Solutions' main office is in New York City, I've been living for the last 7 months in Concord, New Hampshire. And so, yeah, a city not unlike Portland in terms of its form, its values, its development history. And one of the things that I think is especially important for these older and very self-aware communities in terms of our urban fabric and the kind of the style and feel of our neighborhoods is the fact that ADUs are really old news here. What you're looking at is a satellite image of the block that I've been living on. So you see Maple Street, Union Street, Washington, and North Spring Street. Most of these structures were built between like 1850 and 1920. And it's just, first of all, this is the fabric of Concord and gives the downtown neighborhoods their character. But on this block, you have every conceivable kind of housing that could never be built under existing zoning, let me add. But you'll see, like on the lower part of that angle, the corner of Maple and Union, there is, and there's a closer shot in the next slide, there are houses that are set back, on the corner. Here we go. As you go around the block, buildings that are built with rooming houses, as two-family homes, as just frankly, they stuck housing wherever housing could be stuck because there was an ethic, at that period of the community's growth, that everybody needed to be housed. And I think that's maybe the fundamental question. I suspect Jess will get into it, but we kind of start with that value, and that is part of what unleashes creativity. But looking at just this corner of my block in Concord, you'll see at the corner, there is a home that now has 4 different units in it. The house to the right is a single family dwelling, but in the backyard of both is yet another house, just completely not conforming with anything we think of as appropriate zoning now. But in the footprint of what, even with new proposed code guidelines in Concord, would permit to be 2 structures on that property, you have 6 households being accommodated. And so this idea that ADUs, or really densely utilizing kind of the older neighborhoods and the denser neighborhoods where most of the existing infrastructure exists, this is as old as our communities in New England have existed. And so I just been turning things back to Built for Zero, just like to observe that this is the character of our communities, to be creative, to be resourceful, to use our existing structures densely, to help them evolve, and to do so in the context and in the spirit of, we need to provide a decent and safe and affordable place for everyone. And so if you could advance this slide, Ben, I'll just kind of end my overview by saying, this notion that communities can get to zero homelessness, it's actually happening, but it really begins with the commitment of a whole community to get there. Like the key actors have to be the mayor, county executive, the coalition of groups working on homelessness, the housing authority, the VA for veterans homelessness. But there is really no stopping a community that has made a commitment to that shared aim. Like, we're not going to allow people to suffer in this avoidable way. And that if a community is prepared to share that aim, prepared to organize their efforts around a single team of all of these organizations, each playing whatever role it needs to get to that aim, as opposed to, I've got my program, you've got yours, like that just reinforces the fragmentation that is at the heart of why this issue has been so painful and stubborn. But knowing by name and in real time what's true, like how many people are experiencing the problem, how is it moving and changing, actually gives a common language and glue to this whole collaborative process. And it's in that context that the flexible resources you need, like how do we flex our housing? How do we take backyards, or how do we take side yards? How do we build up to really be driven by a sense of how we flex what we have in order to meet that goal, and then to learn from other communities, like what's working elsewhere. And I'd say in closing, including from our own history, how have we used our built form to actually evolve to meet emerging housing needs? Communities are starting to do this, and I think with the kind of creativity and leadership that is embodied in the Portland Society of Architecture and the people who've involved in this communication, program to sort of spread ideas, I think Portland is just such a ripe atmosphere to really look to its history and to move to a more just future around the issue of homelessness.
Great, thank you, Roseanne. That was fabulous. And interesting, because when we started last week, we had Chris Miller, who gave an overview of the Mainer way of creating these ADUs, fishing shacks, and the eaves of barns, and just again how housing really does organically evolve. And that the conversation last week too spoke at great length about zoning and restrictions. But also many samples from Los Angeles. So Andrew Ashe, who's also on this call, who was a speaker last week, had done a few ADUs in LA and is part of that pilot program. Jess, I would love to open this up to you right now. Let's see, where are you? Jess?
I'm here.
Oh, great, there you are, great. And also,
sorry about that, just shifting rooms.
No, it's okay. We also have, the chat is open. George has been putting some information there about our historic fabric. There is a lot actually out there on what historically housing throughout Maine was. So definitely take advantage of those. And again, after Jess speaks, we'll open this up for conversation. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jess Valero. I identify as non-binary and go by they, them pronouns. Thank you for having me today. I'm 23 years old, and I'm a co-founder and community organizer of the Maine People's Housing Coalition. In 2019, when I was living in the women's shelter, not long after aging out of the teen shelter, I had gotten involved in local politics, from testifying in my local city hall to traveling to Augusta to make a positive impact on the state level. A huge part of my work is bringing directly impacted people to the table of decision makers and sending their voices in our work to end homelessness. I guess I just want to start with a little bit more in depth of what Maine People's Housing Coalition is. Maine People's Housing Coalition is a network of people centered in Greater Portland, Maine, who believe housing is a human right. Our mission is to destigmatize, decriminalize, and end homelessness. We work towards our mission by organizing as many people as possible in mutual aid projects that build solidarity and make our conditions more survivable, and in political projects that expose and overcome the interlocking oppressions of racism, policing and incarceration, misogyny, settler colonialism, our failing child protective services and mental health systems, the overdose crisis, and how all that contributes to what we call homelessness. Our work is led by unhoused peers currently living in shelters, couch surfing, camping out, or experiencing chronic housing insecurity, and we welcome the participation of everyone who shares our goals and values. We know that our people are dying on the streets at unprecedented and underreported rates every day that we aren't changing policies. We didn't create the systems that are killing us, but we have a vision for Maine and the world where homelessness, isolation, and policing are replaced with safe, affordable housing for all, community care, and solidarity. And we plan to make it happen. So that's just a little bit more of what Maine People's Housing Coalition is and the work that we do and our values and where we want to bring our world to. The next piece I want to talk about is something I feel very important and I try to talk about a lot are the untalked about traumas of homelessness, the hidden obstacles, and what it means to be warehoused in a shelter for long periods of time. And this will play into our ADU conversation. I'm currently working on building a pilot program that will build 2 ADUs for 2 people that have experienced chronic homelessness. One of the youth that it would house is someone who has been homeless since being 14 years old and has run away from a very abusive home on many occasions and is still experiencing chronic housing insecurity. So things like that are the things that are often not talked about when talked about homelessness. The things that we should be talking about are domestic violence and how that plays into barriers around housing. We should be talking about the foster care system and how we set up our most vulnerable children to experience homelessness and be stuck in institutions and become institutionalized. The other things we need to talk about is how, with mass incarceration in our country currently, how we don't set people up for success after they have served their time, as I'm going to use in air quotes. We don't talk about how that plays into the children that they may have or the families that they may be coming from. We don't talk about how they may end up out on the streets after that and end up experiencing long-term homelessness. And then another piece I just want to talk about is the warehousing piece. I have experienced chronic homelessness for the past 6 years. I'm currently housed, but one thing that I have experienced and I've seen firsthand is that when we warehouse a bunch of people into a small space and it's not technically a social service program, it's a shelter. So it's just meant to keep people from sleeping outside in large quantities. What happens is that it creates this, what I call a division of the poor and a division of the vulnerable, because you essentially warehouse a bunch of people that have complex trauma and have been in the foster care system, have been severely abused, people that have been human trafficked, people that really just can't catch a break and don't have the community or resources to lift themselves out of a hole that they haven't necessarily put themselves into, which I think is another misconception around homelessness. One of my core beliefs is that once we can talk about how these different institutions and these different ways of caring for people experiencing homelessness and our overall approach to solving homelessness or ending homelessness isn't working, then we can actually head in a more efficient direction to gain that goal of having zero homelessness. Another just little side story, just to kind of give a little bit more of an image for people. As someone who both lived in the teen shelter here in Portland, but also lived in the women's shelter here in Portland, there is this woman, I'm gonna call her Mary. She had been in the shelter for a relatively long time, had been there for about 2.5 years. This is about 2 years I had been in the women's shelter at that point. And she was okay. She was like relatively sane. She was working a job. She was doing great. And then what happened is that because of a variety of different factors, other women started bullying her while she was in the TV room. And because of the layout of the shelter, this wasn't something that the staff were able to notice a lot of the time or really intercept in, because in the layout of the shelter, the staff desk is in the front and the TV room is tucked into a corner in the back off of the cafeteria. So this woman was severely bullied, and due to that severe bullying, she started to develop paranoia and some schizophrenic tendencies. So every once in a while, she would start going off on tangents and start screaming in the living room, which is something that she didn't normally do. And then I ended up leaving, getting house for a little bit and coming back to the shelter. And when I returned, this woman had a psychotic break. Every morning she would spend 5 hours screaming in the shower at the top of her lungs, and there was no calming her down. So that's a very like intense glimpse of what it can be like and what are the really negative side effects of warehousing people, and just a further prompting of why we need ADUs and tiny houses, amongst many other things. I'm just gonna leave that there, I think. I can't hear you.
You would think, we all make that joke that you would think we would know better. Thank you for sharing that. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Tiny Houses project? And I know actually Kara Wilbur with both YIMBY and Build Maine is working with you on that. And so I think it's really important to hear how that process is going actually, and you know, what you're running into, what is working and what isn't. Sorry, Jesse, I'm going to mute.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll actually drop our GoFundMe link right in the chat, which actually will show you, you can read Kai's story, which is a youth that will be housing through this tiny homes project. I'll actually drop that right now before I forget. So we just launched our GoFundMe officially. Our pilot program essentially is we are looking for homeowners in the Portland area who have open minds, who would be willing to partner with us on this pilot program and house one of these 2 participants in their backyard, and would be willing to do that long term. Essentially, the goal is just direct action, just build the housing, give it to the people that need it, and find somewhere for it to go. And the strategy that we're going with that, we did get ADUs passed at the city level. I'm unsure of the logistics around that, and just a little bureaucratic things that I'm sure Kara is working on right now. But the goal is essentially just house people and then ask for forgiveness afterwards. So I'm actually really excited about this project. So it'll be housing Kai, who you'll read her story as you go through the GoFundMe, but it'll also house another young woman and her 4-year-old son who have been couch surfing and experiencing homelessness for about 5 years now.
One thing that I was curious about, and Roseanne, I don't know if you came across this, but I believe it was in Oakland where there are some subsidies that will help homeowners supplement the build out.
Mhm.
And so for a number of years, if they, without cost, use that for someone who's experiencing houselessness, then it's actually a forgiven investment. Is that something?
I've read about it and met with the people who are designing it. I'm not sure where it is in its implementation. I think one of the things that is tricky is like how to actually sync up any of these investments with actually, a strategy to reduce homelessness. One of the tensions I know that, there's been like, so you get a city subsidy, who's overseeing the fact that you don't turn it into an Airbnb unit, that there has to be oversight.
Absolutely. Then the other piece, Jess, I know you had mentioned living in the shelter. You too have taken a position against putting the tiny houses together collectively, creating villages, that they really should be embedded within the community rather than, again, isolated or separate. Is that
right? I think one of the biggest factors in homelessness is lack of community. It's really a bunch of people that have no healthy support system and no one to turn to. So one of the biggest thing is not taking this population and either like crowding them together and warehousing them, whether that's in tiny houses or in a large space, or pushing them on the outskirts away from the community that they've been in. Those are two huge factors in people experiencing homelessness. And this is something that we've also talked to both of the people that we're working with on the pilot program. Because funny enough, they actually know each other and don't get along. So like things like that, especially when it comes to homelessness, it's kind of like a battle for resources. So it's very easy for there to be that just kind of like infighting between people experiencing homelessness. And you also take into the factor of trauma and how like one of the many ways that trauma manifests is lack of conflict resolution skills or emotional regulation skills. So in those conflicts, they can get escalated like fairly quickly. Not with everybody. This is like an overall just like insight on the just like shelter life in general. But that's something to be taken into factor when it comes to, are we really helping people and improving the quality of life? So it's just very important that everybody has their own spaces and we don't just kind of recreate the shelter in a different capacity.
So questions are starting to come in on the chat, and I would welcome folks to unmute themselves and actually ask, or I can read them. It really depends. Jim Hall has raised his hand, but Anne Pringle asks a question. Anne, would you like to just ask it and speak, or you are more than welcome?
I'll speak.
Okay, great.
Our R6 zone allows the kind of development that Roseanne was talking about. But since it was changed 4 or 5 years ago, what we're getting instead, because of the very hot real estate market here, is big boxes and very expensive condos. So how do we get the kind of housing you're both talking about? I hear the suggestion of subsidies, but where does the money for the kinds and level of subsidies needed, where does that money come from? Thank you.
Yeah, a very good question, Anna. And Addie can jump in with the local knowledge. But I'll say if we're talking about new development and expensive privately owned sites, you're already kind of almost in a different space than the ADU conversation. The typical tools nationally are the low-income housing tax credit, and many states have additional kind of complementary subsidy programs. Frankly, with the American Rescue Plan, there'll be a lot of money coming into communities for affordable housing. So there's this new source, but what is often problematic, because it just expensive land drives up the cost of housing and pushes to other uses than affordable housing. There's a real I think imperative that publicly owned land, land owned by not-for-profits that is untaxed because of a mission purpose. That's where I think some of the development needs to go for the larger multifamily developments that would probably fit within an R6 zone and really optimize the development capacity there. So there are tools for that kind of larger development. It's typically more experienced developers who know how to use them. But what's really cool about ADUs is if the zoning is permissive, and in many downtown communities and in older cities it is, you don't have to go out and acquire the land. This is about how do you use more intensively properties that have already been built out to a degree. So in a yard or in a side yard, therefore the actual cost involved is much less than buying a new piece of land for development that has expansive zoning that would make it more expensive. It's actually, in an ideal situation, an ADU means there is no land price. So already it's a less expensive proposition. And one of the things that I think is needed, and I'll ask Addie to say if this already exists in Portland, are some dedicated funding streams to help homeowners take advantage of that opportunity. Typically, you would look for a community development finance institution or a financing entity, of which there are, typically communities have access to these, not all, that is in the business of providing lower cost financing to projects that are around community wealth building, that are about more public purpose oriented projects that are designed to help accelerate and expand construction of affordable housing. So there could be a resource there. The other side of this, Anne, is would an individual or household like the households that Jess was describing, would they still need an individual rent subsidy to help them cover the cost once they could move into a new place? And again, this is where really having a very clear view of your system is so important, so that the subsidy dollars that are available through HUD or local, Maine may have local subsidy programs to help individuals with disabilities who need some assistance to pay a standard rent for an area, that those subsidies need to be kind of directed to people who need them and actually match to these types of housing situations that are available. There will be a lot of new resources in this respect coming to communities through the American Rescue Plan. So now's a really good time for Portland to kind of figure out how you put these pieces together to make it easier for owners who would have no land cost to help build a unit, and to tie in like where could individuals who need some additional financial support get that support. All of the pieces are out there or coming into place. Now's a good time to figure out how to organize them.
And I would absolutely defer to many on this call that have a much better idea of our local funding, our community housing trust fund. Chris Miller wrote in, what about Section 8 vouchers? And I also know that Housing First has been subsidizing some of these programs in Oakland. That's why I brought it up. And Housing First usually does go towards the build out of shelters. And I also know that through this recovery, FEMA has been tapped to do some work. And interestingly, not our ideal scenario, thinking of the FEMA trailers, but FEMA is already involved in housing multiple large-scale populations through emergencies. So there's a way, and again, the many minds on this call know more than I do. So I would absolutely defer to them. And I think Jim was next with his question. Jim Hall, yeah.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more from, the larger view of where we've seen success, how to coordinate this vision. Actually, I want to interrupt myself and just thank Jess for the awesome rapid response action that's already working. It's just amazing. But I think Portland has been doing pretty good with our long-term stayer initiative. There's a new diversion program coming to figure out how to prevent people from having to enter an emergency system. A resettlement coordinator for international asylum seekers, alternative response coordinator and community policing. They want to build a safer shelter with a better layout and wraparound services. And they've definitely been prioritizing housing, including ADUs. At the state level, we've got the Maine Homeless Council that's strategizing a coordinated system to build on Portland's model of this regional intake hub and placement of specialist partners for youth or victims of domestic abuse. And I love their phrase of let's make homelessness rare, one time, and brief. And supporting that are several bills in the legislature that would fund that model. And I guess I kind of wonder, the Greater Portland Council of Governments recently did a study finding that most zoning in this region outside of Portland doesn't even allow for multi-unit housing, let alone shelters or ADUs or anything. And so how do you coordinate this? And there's this sort of push me pull you as well. The citizens in Portland just passed this Green Deal that actually makes it more expensive to build affordable housing in Portland. So advice from the bigger picture of who coordinates all that?
Is that a question that you'd like me to address?
I guess so. Yeah, not just
okay.
certainly.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, yeah, it's terrific to know about all of these investments in coordination and getting to outcomes that Maine and Portland are already making. So there's great momentum, as I'm hearing. in the communities that are actually seeing reductions and have reached zero veteran or chronic homelessness and are now on the way to zero for all, meaning homelessness is rare and brief, quickly detected and quickly resolved when it happens. What they have in common is a core team that is made up minimally of the mayor or county executives lead on this issue, the continuum of care, or some coordinating representative of the not-for-profit organizations in the community, the VA, who controls resources for veterans experiencing homelessness, and the housing authority. And we ask for a community and Built for Zero that team designate someone who to serve as the leader, the coordinator. It doesn't matter who, just that everyone agrees to kind of follow that person's lead as the facilitator. And that we also ask them to identify a data lead, someone who is collecting and updating all of the information that is shared, now privacy protected and used kind of only when needed, as one would in a medical context, to get people housed. But it's this creation of almost a command center, like really treating homelessness as the emergency it is, where there's clear accountability that is shared across these different entities, that everyone is working toward the same aim, and testing new approaches based on what the data is saying. If there's an increase or there's an acceleration and decreases, how do you do more of that? How do you intervene differently upstream? And so it's a real kind of a climate that's established on that team that is much more about the outcome and iterating what has to be done rather than sticking with a rigid plan. So that's the basic structure, Jim. And it has to be government, not-for-profits, and really held. This mutual accountability is supported by kind of a shared truth. Everyone is seeing how the issue is moving and changing, and knows down to the person level, who's getting stuck, who's not moving through the system, who's coming in. Is it someone who's been assisted before? What happened that the assistance wasn't effective? So it's this dynamic process that frankly matches a dynamic problem and is sort of a breakthrough in that response, can keep pace with homelessness rather than more static responses.
Thanks, that was great.
And then Mark, you had your hand up. I want to grab you.
Yeah, Roseanne, thank you so much. And Jess, really, thank you for your honesty. And just listening to Jess, I have just come back and returned from my own leave of absence, if you will, from the bank, and just pondering what Jess said just made me realize that we're hopefully coming through this pandemic, all of us that are on this call today. And the one thing that's so interesting to me is that, I had some time to really, I live, Roseanne, 2 blocks off of Congress Street. So I'm experiencing and seeing the homeless firsthand, just like Addie. And Addie and I have had extensive conversations about it because, we all want to help. But COVID really put us all on a level playing field when it comes to a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic. It doesn't matter your economic status. We all got there, I think. I mean, we're not going to talk about our individual stories on this call, but it certainly humbled me a lot to know, wow, what it's like to be in a pandemic and what that can do to your mind. What are your thoughts? Because, look, I'm in finance and banking, and we are constantly, I know my bank is very supportive when it comes to financial literacy. And we are open to anybody, whether they're a customer, they're homeless, if they're a new Mainer, we're excited to talk to everybody about becoming more literate and how we can deliver that education. Because we know, and I'm personally committed in almost 20 years of working in banking to building financial wealth, no matter what the starting point is. But you got to start somewhere. And the one thing I have learned is it does take a village, if you will. It takes a team. But how do we collectively bring the right team to that individual, especially our homeless population, where we can show a success out of that situation, right? So I guess that's a little bit of a loaded question, And I hope I set that up right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this really does have to be an all of community undertaking. You know, government has its role, not-for-profits, you know, certainly the business community, and frankly, people experiencing homelessness themselves, as Jess described. Like, the best information on whether the system is working is going to be, you know, coming to you from people who are experiencing, you know, what it's like to be seeking help in a crisis and what's working and what isn't. Mark, I would say that the question that was asked earlier about financing, this seems to be like a unique role that the business community and those with, yeah, in the financial sector could play. Like, what would be required to help those homeowners in Portland who have the ability to add an ADU to their property? Could you create a financial product to make that simple? So you don't have to be like a real estate developer, but just a homeowner who wants to help. If your bank could figure out a package to make that simple, that would be a huge contribution to reducing homelessness in Portland.
Roseanne, would you, and just as a follow-up question to that, do you think right now there's a good political, you know, climate to look at even some type of, we all know, you know, President Biden just talked about a capital gains increase. Do you think there's a possibility that there could be an exception to that for homeowners or developers that specifically, you know?
Yeah, you know, that's a really interesting question, Mark. And I think that's the kind of thing in terms of local or state policy that could be like, if there's a really, you know, straightforward production package that you figured out the financing, the city has, you know, kind of figured out like the zoning context, and the state or city could, you know, could look at whether there could be some additional tax incentives. That's in the spirit of everybody doing what they can do to just make homelessness rare and brief in Portland and throughout the state.
And we are, next week actually is all about the financing. I think one of the caveats here is, you know, Carol put in a question, what's the permitting process? It's fascinating because the planning department developed policy for most lots to have up to 2 units. But then when you really do run, I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this competition is to look at the square footage, the allotment, the setbacks, but then also when you think about permitting and fire and safety, hooking up to utilities, what you need to do, the cost just rises. So balancing that is part of the riddle of this. You know, it potentially has extraordinary impact in housing many people and increasing density, but there are these hurdles, which, you know, again, we'll be pointing out. We don't have to, we don't need a competition to point that out. We can just talk about that very quickly. George has a question. Go ahead, you can, let's see. You should be able to, are you on, George?
I'm unmuted now, thank you. I just, I guess one question for Jess and Roseanne is, I think if people are honest, we have created an artificial housing crisis, and we all have a role to play. The banking industry loves to see rising property values because it protects their mortgage investments. But when you have rising property values, you're pricing people out. And if you own a house in a place where the, you know, costs of land is going up, that is something that you benefit from. But it also prevents somebody from outside the community from being able to buy in. And the building codes that have evolved, you know, basically since the 1920s, they're also well-intentioned, but to be honest, they're not actually meant to really keep people safe as much as they are to make sure that housing is expensive. A good example is, you know, in Europe, a lot of apartment buildings don't need 2 stairwells. You can get away with 1 stairwell. And if you do any building, you realize just how much money you would save by only having to build one stairwell in a building, a 4 or 5 story building. And especially with lot sizes and zoning setbacks, if you can't build a second stairwell because you don't have enough room in the building to make it happen, the building just doesn't happen.
Mhm.
So what I wanted to ask Jess and Roseanne is, you guys have to literally go out and tell people you need to make room for everybody, and that something has to give when you do that. And that's our problem in Portland, and it's a problem everywhere in the United States, is when it comes to making a sacrifice to make room for people you don't necessarily, want in your community, something has to give. I don't know. I mean, you can beat around the bush all we want. The ADU phenomenon to me is a way of kind of soft pedaling this question is, oh, if we just have one little backyard, mother-in-law apartment, then people can accept that. But if you have 6 mother-in-law apartments on a block, then suddenly it all goes to hell, and you got to shut it all down. We can't fix the crisis that we started without acknowledging that we have the power to do it. We just have to say yes to people that make us uncomfortable. I just want to know how you've been able to explain this to people that just don't get it.
Well, I think you stated what's really at stake very well, George. It's the common good versus, just, kind of exaggerated, kind of private concerns that, stand in the way of really resolving something that absolutely is fixable. As your point that this is a manufactured crisis is spot on. I take great hope from the fact that you really don't have to have everybody agreeing that, like we rise or fall together. Like the whole world is still in the midst of this experience of our interdependence. And what you do need in a community is a few leaders who are willing to work together in new ways. And that, it's been so powerful to see that in all these built for zero communities, they don't operate by consensus. They're like, this is the goal. Who's going to show up to advance it? And they are grinding it out. And then what is always pretty predictable and wonderful, you just always live in hope, is that people who often were very resistant at first, they see which way the wind is blowing. They see that that the folks that they've othered as people that they don't feel comfortable around, actually, like the whole community benefits when everyone has a decent place to live. I mean, the cost of homelessness is borne by whole communities. It's borne brutally by people experiencing the problem, but it is, it's everyone feels a sense of diminished community when vulnerable people are struggling on the street and visible as, kind of an indictment of our community systems that aren't holding. So I know you don't have to get everybody. You just have to get the determined few. And this data-driven accountability, I'm telling you, is powerful. The fact that when communities can see and trust that there is a real accounting for everyone and see how the issue is moving and changing, and that you can impact it by, shifting a policy, shifting the way organizations work or prioritize resources, that becomes like this really powerful force that is defeating the pessimism in community after community and driving changes in local behavior around openness to new housing and to inclusion. So, you're only going to change this by doing it.
Brilliant. I want to point out that it's 1 o'clock, and I know that we're very respectful of everyone's time. We can go a little bit over, but Jess and Roseanne, I want to just check in with you first. We can take a few more questions. And I also just want to bring up, Kim Sutton wrote really about the lack of contractors. And if you actually have the funds in hand, another issue that comes up is getting a reliable contractor to actually build this. This also came up last week when Greg Norton was talking about his project in South Portland. Roseanne does have to leave. So I want to thank you very, very much. It's always extraordinary to welcome you virtually to Portland, and I am looking forward to the day that physically we can get you here again, which seems to be on some horizon somewhere.
Well, thank you. And Jess, so glad to connect, and let's keep in touch.
Absolutely.
It was great to meet you.
Likewise. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I will say that I think with our committee on the line, we are going to have to think too about the contracting piece and the build out. Who's building these? It's funny, Jesse Thompson's name is appearing on the speaker screen. And last week he did get a plug for Brightbuilt, which is one of his companies that has the prefab homes. There are a number. And we've talked about that too, like what is the affordability, what is the access to materials and contractors. So we'll keep that in mind. And I want to just thank anyone with closing remarks. You are more than welcome to share thoughts. And also we will continue the dialogue. I'm really grateful for you spending your Friday lunch hour with us. Jess, that was really extraordinary. So thank you very, very much. Anyone want to say any last words?
Just that, you know what, I'll say something, Addie. I thank you so much for putting this together. And Jess, if I don't see her on the call still, I invite you and your friends to come in. We're glad to talk about anything financially that we can help with when it comes to financial literacy, and that includes anybody on today's call.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. And again, next Friday at noon, again, we'll be talking about financing. So really getting into the weeds on this. And yeah, keep a lookout for when the competition drops. Thank you again to my committee. Thank you again to Mark and People's Bank, which I have to get used to saying MMT. And this will be uploaded in a few hours. So thank you.